We know that climate change disproportionately affects those of us who are already struggling. But can climate mitigation and adaptation policy be designed in a way that promotes environmental justice? And if so, how?
Hello and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with my co-host, Kyla Hewson.
On today's episode, we spoke with Anna Shipp and Joseph Schilling of the Urban Institute's Research to Action Lab about the Justice40 initiative, a Biden-era policy where 40% of federal climate change spending is supposed to be used to benefit equity-deserving communities. The Urban Institute is an organization focused on equity and social mobility, and it has researched climate justice issues, including challenges in implementing Justice40.
Justice40 was a major step change in climate justice policy, but unfortunately it was repealed by the Trump administration. Even though it's no longer U.S. federal government policy, we still wanted to put out an episode on Justice40 because it's one of the first serious efforts to center environmental justice in climate change policy. And although it was imperfect, as we'll hear, it provides some important lessons that we can learn from. Let's get started. The Urban Institute, it's focused on equity and social mobility, and your organization has researched different aspects of this topic, including climate justice. Can you talk a little bit about how climate change might intersect with different forms of inequity?
Sure. And just the disclaimer that Joe and I can speak for the research, but not necessarily for Urban as an organization. But for this one, globally speaking, those who contribute the least to climate change are those who tend to be most at risk from its impacts. In the States, right, those most vulnerable from the risks related to climate change are the same communities and populations that have been marginalized in other ways. Folks with lower incomes, folks of color, and these pre-existing vulnerabilities, be they, economic, social, health, compound the damage then from climate change related disaster and make it much harder for those populations to bounce back, which of course further exacerbates inequities. And then of course, when it comes to climate action and related investments, kind of on the inverse, as with renewable energy efficiency, not every community currently benefits equitably. And that's both from the access to the investments themselves, the jobs that those investments create and support, and that's part of where efforts related to a just transition come from.
The only thing I would add is lifting up the impact on health. So as we confront climate change, the inequities that we have developed over decades of disinvestment and land use policy here in the U.S. has led to a lot of health disparities, so that those who are really most vulnerable, as Anna was saying, to the impacts of climate are also the ones who have a lot of underlying health disparities as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the Shared Prosperity Partnership. So from my understanding, it's looking at how to build a more equitable, inclusive, and climate resilient cities. Can you tell me a little bit more about that project?
So backing up a little bit, there's a growing movement among economists, practitioners, advocates centered around advancing a redistributive and regenerative economic framework as an effective strategy to achieve the interdependent and really necessary outcomes of economic health and resilience, equity and justice, climate action, right? And the core principles behind a redistributive and regenerative economic framework are explained really well by Kate Raworth, who's an economist behind the book Donut Economics, if folks are familiar with that. And she notes that the aim is to really meet the needs of all people within the means of a living planet. And that's including by shifting power and resources and, of course, healing Earth's natural systems. And so the movement itself is responding to several drivers, including rising inequalities across measures, which we've talked about already, right? Income, wealth, health, as well as the current and projected impacts of climate change. And so U.S. cities in general, but we're kind of in the context of the states, play a really important role in advancing a redistributive and regenerative economic framework. In the States, cities are currently home to 80% of the population, and that's expected to continue to grow. And while some cities have leveraged economic recoveries to improve opportunities for residents to benefit from and contribute to economic prosperity, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, particularly for marginalized populations. And then, of course, also because of large populations and related proportional high use of energy and other resources, right? Cities are responsible for emitting a large proportion of greenhouse gases, right, and other drivers of climate change, right, and kind of the other natural resources. All of that combined, plus a bunch of other factors, right, of course, create the need and opportunity to support cities to advance equity and climate action and do so in a way that builds towards collective impact. And again, keeping that framework in mind of also needing kind of the economic health and well-being to be present as well. And then you have the other immediate opportunity around, again, in the States, leveraging federal funds, particularly the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and having the opportunity and need, right, to help localities leverage those funds to advance those local goals. And so the Shared Prosperity Partnership, which is a collaboration between the Kresge Foundation, Urban, and Brookings, fits in all of that because its work is really to support local leaders to both leverage federal funds to advance those local goals around economic health, equity, and climate action, and to support local leaders to leverage what's in their own jurisdictional power to do the same and to amplify all of those learnings by sharing those successes across cities and leadership.
I'm wondering, if you could elaborate on some of those successes that you just mentioned there. What do you think are some promising practices that are coming out of this project?
I'll share some of the current research that we're doing, which I think is really exciting. So one of the work streams that we have is around helping local leaders leverage the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act to advance equitable workforce development and career pathways, particularly in green jobs. And so how those climate investments, right, how those environmental justice investments can not only be capital projects that benefit communities, right, but they can also be opportunities for quality jobs in place. And that kind of is a bridge to another research stream, which is about quality jobs. There are provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act around quality jobs. And what does that mean? And how are we helping local leaders advance those at a local level? We're also looking into how climate action plans can be a tool for economic health and equity, and looking at how climate forward and equitable development principles can be applied in planning and implementation for major alternative transit projects. And then also looking at equitable economic ecosystems, including the super wonky but very important topic of procurement, particularly for women and BIPOC-owned businesses.
Wow, so really a range of initiatives. You said, Joe, you've been working on this project for a while as well. What are some of the sort of key insights that you've gleaned?
Well, one of the unique things about the Shared Prosperity Partnership is this intersection, as Anna pointed out, between economic prosperity and trying to address some of the inequities when it comes to sort of social and economic challenges. But this year, there's much more of a focus on the impact on climate equity, resilience, and sustainability. The other dimension to SP2 in the work that Urban has done, as well as with Kresge and Brookings, is building the capacity of what I would call our intermediaries. So in each of the different SP2 cities, there's a core partner, really a backbone organization that Kresge and Brookings and Urban work with. And it may be around a particular issue or a particular policy or program, but there's often a lot of capacity building that we provide or that others, within our network provide to that entity. So a good example is the work that I've been doing through SP2 is with the Central Valley Community Foundation in Fresno, California. And Fresno, it's a relatively large city in the Central Valley, but it's also one of the poorest cities in the country. And so through the SP2 partnership, we've had a relationship with them for over guess since 2018 and working on different projects related to wealth creation, civic infrastructure, and now work that relates more to climate and sustainability.
How do you think building more equitable cities helps us to advance things like climate resilience?
Well, cities in some ways are pivotal, right, in trying to build climate resilience. I mean, as Anna pointed out, right, all the research shows that cities have been at the forefront of creating a lot of the challenges that we see, not only greenhouse gases, but also with land use policies that have been discriminatory towards communities of color. And at the same time, we're seeing that cities are where we can find a lot of the more innovative practices on climate resilience. Philadelphia, where Anna is located, was an older industrial city that had lost population, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And about 20 years ago, started to turn that around and really led with urban greening and sustainability and building a more sort of climate resilient and equitable community. Still a long way to go, but I think that example helps illustrate the importance of cities in our fight against climate change.
I'm wondering if either of you can talk maybe specifically about housing. I know housing quality regulation is one of the things that was talked about in this project, but how do you think the issue of housing connects into both those issues of equitable cities and climate resilience?
I could give you a couple of highlights. I think where the intersection on climate is both kind of offense and defense, right? So on the defensive side, you find that the more vulnerable families in communities of color are the ones who live in substandard housing conditions, older apartment buildings. And you find in the older cities, right, that's maybe the only places that they can afford. And so housing stability becomes really critical. And yet you also find in these same neighborhoods, they're the ones that don't have tree cover, right? Or they're ones that are in low-lying parts of the city. So they're more vulnerable to floods and heat. Trying to develop a more holistic approach to housing through the lens of climate. Certainly the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the new federal statutes of trying to provide resources to local governments and communities to make housing improvements and to make some of those housing more energy efficient. But, it's still what I would say a work in progress. There's still a lot of work to be done.
All right, let's move on to talk about Justice40. So, just for context for listeners, in January 2021, the Biden administration created the Justice40 initiative through an executive order. Wondering if you can just tell us briefly what is Justice40 and why is it important?
Well, Justice40, through this executive order, really established for the federal government kind of a new policy pathway. So in the past, federal action around environmental justice and executive orders were often designed to bring organizations together and create principles, kind of like rules of engagement, and there would be lots of conferences, but not a lot of action. So Justice40 basically establishes a program within the federal government that says that 40% of all of the investments that the federal government has are supposed to benefit, they use the term disadvantaged communities. So it's an executive order. It's not legislation enacted by Congress, but it really establishes this now as what should be the standard operating practice for federal agencies when they're providing technical assistance and grants and resources to be able to channel the federal agencies into communities that really have been disadvantaged for decades.
Can you talk a little bit more about sort of that disinvestment and, why is it that disadvantaged communities, why is there this gap?
The U.S. has had a long history of policies that have segregated communities. So these policies have, in some ways, identified communities of color for the lack of, federal resources or state resources, whether that policy was housing redlining as early as the 30s and 40s, or urban renewal, another infrastructure investment in the 50s and 60s that built our national highway system, or exclusionary zoning at the local level. So it's kind of a cumulative impact on these neighborhoods that then led to a lot of disinvestment and concentrated poverty over many years.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the context in which Justice 40 came up. Were there previous initiatives that tried to do something about environmental justice in America, either federally or in the states?
Environmental justice at the federal level emerged in 1994 with the Clinton administration. So they were the first sort of executive order really using the term environmental justice. And that created the Office of Environmental Justice in the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. There was a lot of, again, activity at the EPA in terms of changing some internal rules and regulations. But, there wasn't as much action, I think, as environmental justice advocates had hoped. And I do think it's important and acknowledge that the history of the environmental justice movement was built on research. So there was kind of a famous report by Dr. Bullard out of sort of Atlanta, and his analysis of some of the environmental injustices with industries being closely connected to Black and brown communities in the South. And that report in 1987 really coined and put environmental justice on the map. So a lot of the activities, even today, can kind of trace its roots to that report. But then, the Clinton administration advanced as sort of far as they could. And then the Obama administration did a little bit of work in trying to advance environmental justice. But it seems that President Biden and his team have really elevated environmental justice as a critical priority.
I'm really glad that you've sort of highlighted some of the different elements of injustice. That it's not only economic, but also racial, and there are other kinds of disadvantage as well. The Justice 40 commitment is that 40% of climate spending goes to disadvantaged communities. What is a disadvantaged community, and how do government officials go about measuring it?
Disadvantaged, the way the federal government is defining it in the context of Justice 40, is around communities that have been hardest hit by adverse environmental, economic, health disinvestment in general. And they've developed the climate and environmental justice screening tool as a way to identify those communities based on the presence or absence of, some of these burdens. And that tool, if you look at it, identifies basically a third of the US as disadvantaged. And what's interesting is that those measures, even though race is the most significant and consistent predictor of disadvantage in that definition, race itself wasn't used as a factor in the tool. And the tool itself doesn't consider cumulative burden or cumulative harm, right? And so it's really just, is this burden, is this harm present? Yes or no, not the degree to which, or whether or not those burdens or harms are compounded. So it's likely a much different picture with some of those gaps in the tool itself. In the Justice 40 research that we did, we talked about that particular piece of Justice 40 is the importance of identifying, prioritizing communities of the greatest need to then channel the resources appropriately, and giving communities the opportunity to petition their own status so that they can be eligible for Justice 40 eligible funding. When it comes to the benefits, that's also an open question, right? And that was something that we explored as well in the research that we did, was what does 40% of the benefits mean? Is it 40% of the dollars that are spent? Is it what those dollars are doing in terms of capital projects, The number of dollars, where those dollars land in place, the kinds of projects, that those dollars are being spent on, the jobs themselves, right, that are being created and supported? Are we talking about the business opportunities, right, for local women and BIPOC owned firms? Air quality, right, water quality, soil quality, right? What are the kind of benefits that we're talking about? Also kind of exploring the importance of making sure that those benefits, to the extent possible, that success is defined by the communities themselves who are intended to be benefiting from these dollars. Every place is going to have a different priority, right, or set of priorities. What does it look like then for Justice40 to be a federal initiative that needs accountability, that needs oversight for the volume of dollars that are being spent, while also giving flexibility to localities, to communities, right, who are disadvantaged, who have been disadvantaged and disinvested in, to be able to say, this is how we want to see our community change and improve that benefits us. And that's tricky.
Yeah, those are really big questions to sort through. And am I right in understanding that it's still pretty early stages, and so these questions are really open live issues?
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. As part of our research, we also did outreach to some of the federal agencies who were involved, and they were still in the process of figuring out how they would apply those Justice40 guidance and be able to apply that to the different types of programs that they administer. Because there is, I think, a challenge for the federal agencies and the communities as well to align the typical funding pathways for a lot of these federal programs. Some of them go to the states, and then the states pass those to local governments. Justice40, as well as some of the more recent Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, now make community-based organizations and intermediaries eligible for federal funding. So there is a game of trying to identify, well, if you're dealing with drinking water, or you're dealing with urban forestry, where is that money? What pathway is it coming through? And then, as Anna was saying, okay, now we have to define, what the benefit is, as well as the community, and making sure that the community is involved in those decisions. So it's creating more of what I would say is a network, kind of a holistic network of thinking about this reallocation of federal resources, but there's still a lot of details to work out for sure.
One of the things that your research had raised in terms of defining the benefits of Justice40 was that these programs could potentially actually harm the communities that they're intended to help. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that happens, or how that could potentially happen, and what maybe could be some steps to avoid harming those communities.
Yeah, I think the trick is distinguishing intent from impact. And if we look at, as Joe spoke to earlier, if we look at the history of policy and other decision making, right, in the United States over many centuries, you can argue that there's been good intent but negative impacts. You could also argue in looking at other things that there's been malintent, right, and subsequent impacts, right? The importance of any spending and any policy making, among many considerations, is thinking towards both doing the most good and for whom, and doing the least harm and for whom. And so with Justice40, one of the concerns that folks that we engaged lifted up, because we also engaged a lot of leaders who work with and in and serve some of the communities that Justice40 intends to benefit, that if the focus is only on benefits, then we risk having a blind spot to the potential harms. And I think the highway example that Joe offered earlier is a really good example, where the intent of a lot of those infrastructure investments, from mid-century, and even if you look back into the 30s, right, the New Deal, there was good intent, right, for those investments to benefit communities. And if you look at, again, the legacy of highways and other major transit infrastructure in the states, they segregated and kind of cut off and plowed through, right, communities of color and low-income communities. And so if we're only looking at the benefits and we're not necessarily paying as close attention as we need to the potential risks and harms that those same dollars might be creating.
One thing I would add is that Justice40 is in some ways a pilot as the federal agencies apply it initially to competitive grants. So those are ones where the federal agencies have more discretion. The open question is applying Justice40 to what's called formula grants, which is, again, predominantly the infrastructure, the roads, the transportation grants that funnel through states and regional metropolitan planning organizations. So there's been some state agencies that have interpreted that Justice40 doesn't apply to those grants. And that's where, again, as Anna was pointing out, historically, we've had some of the more damaging, investments through those formula grants. So we'll be watching to see how that plays out.
Now that actually gets me to the next question that I wanted to ask, which was about program structure. Because one of the things that was highlighted in your research was how program structure can actually inadvertently put some of the most vulnerable communities at a disadvantage. Can you talk to me a little bit more about how that happens?
There's a lot of layers to that question. I think one, just starting at the top, right? One of the challenges that stakeholders lifted up is that the money that's flowing through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act is flowing through the same pathways that it's flowed through for decades. And that those pathways in and of themselves have not been very accessible to, right, the lesser resourced and lesser capacity places. You're trying to connect dollars with need, but you're not necessarily changing the pathways, right, through which those dollars flow. That's inherently challenging. Getting a little bit deeper, it's the nature of competitive funds in the first place. It's the challenges of being a lesser capacity, lesser resourced place in being able to identify that funds are available, right? That takes work and effort and knowledge and right and time to be in a position where you even have the plan or a list of projects that are ready to go that are then able to be put into such a response. And having those plans and having that list of projects also takes resources and sort of preparation and forethought. And for lesser resourced and lower capacity places, any city really, it's a lot of reaction, right? It's a lot of putting out fires. And so it's harder for some places to be proactive and think in that way to be ready for when dollars come online. And so it's the structure of the funds themselves. It's a lot of it is the turnaround time, the requirements of some of these proposals. Reporting requirements are pretty tricky as well. And so the federal government has put in place, because they're recognizing this, some support for training and technical assistance for lesser capacity and lower resourced places. And there are organizations, some of whom we engaged in our work, who are trying to provide that training and technical assistance and capacity building to some of those lesser resourced and lower capacity places to help them connect with the dollars themselves. And if you go back to thinking about how a third of the country, right, is identified currently as disadvantaged through the federal definition, then you can kind of appreciate that the resources, both through the TTA grants and training technical assistance support provided by nonprofit organizations, just isn't possibly going to meet the scale of the need. It's good, and there's, of course, always more to be done.
What about accountability? That was another thing that your research highlighted, that Justice40 could use some improvements on accountability. So what did you find?
So as we talked about earlier, Justice40 lives in an executive order. So that means there's no legislation behind it other than the bills that are kind of feeding money right into the programs that Justice 40 is noting as being eligible. And there isn't currently, at least as of the time that we published the research in October and November of 2022, there wasn't any single body, there was no funding, right, for Justice 40 itself, for the implementation of Justice 40 itself, for the oversight of Justice 40. It's sort of this decentralized approach. The idea is for it to be embedded kind of whole of government and be embedded in every single agency, starting with, right, these pilots, the agencies that kind of hold these pilot programs. And they're tasked with defining benefits and, identifying metrics and engaging communities, right, and kind of measuring success in those ways. But the nature of a decentralized approach, right, is inherently, it helps to embed, but it also is inherently challenging because there is difficulty then in centralized oversight, centralized accountability, centralized support, right, and guidance, and those kinds of things. So it's a both and, right? There's benefits to how the approach is being done, but there's also some significant challenges. One of the other pieces that surfaced in our work is who is accountable and what, if any, consequences will there be if goals are not met? Is it the federal government and these agencies that are accountable since it's their goal? Is it for the localities who are receiving the dollars, which is a very kind of standard, right, for accountability is like, we give you the dollars to do X, Y, and Z. Did you or did you not, right? But if we're talking about the framework of Justice 40, is that the appropriate way to think about accountability? And does it risk being punitive, right? Versus, again, kind of supporting the goals of capacity building and resource generation and empowerment. So yeah, just some really big questions. I think a lot of the work that we did was around surfacing questions, surfacing needs, surfacing challenges and opportunities, and offering some high-level, holistic, thematic recommendations. But yeah, there's still some pretty big questions that need a little bit more time to answer.
In one footnote, there has been an update. Believe it or not, there's a new executive order that was signed just last month. And I think it gets to some of the issues that we identified in the research. I don't know if we can take credit for that. I think these issues were things that the federal agencies were already contemplating and advocates were already identifying. But the new executive order does establish a new White House Office of Environmental Justice and a new position, this Federal Chief Environmental Justice Officer. And their goal is to help coordinate across federal agencies the implementation of the federal government's environmental justice policies, including Justice 40. And as part of that, this new executive order makes more explicit that the federal agencies are required to now submit a environmental justice strategic plan to the White House and to the White House Council on Environmental Quality and make it public. Now, again, it doesn't get to the level, I think, of transparency and accountability that we would hope, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
I think Justice 40 is such an interesting initiative. It's arguably a new way of thinking about climate justice in government policy. And your research has identified some really good questions and problems and challenges to address it moving forward. I'm wondering if we can maybe step back to the international context just quickly. For other countries that might be looking at Justice 40 and interested in doing something similar, what would be some of your suggestions of how they could think about doing something like this and how they might want to make certain things different and certain things the same?
Depending on countries, right, our structure and system may not be as parallel as others. But if we were applying this, let's say, in the Canadian context, right, where you've also got a federal system, certainly identifying kind of this overarching framework of having national resources and grants now assessed and evaluated through the lens of disadvantaged communities and channeling resources makes a lot of sense. If I was talking about this in another country and also to the US, is maybe elevating climate vulnerability again, the disparities in the US on sort of socioeconomic level are so great. And we've got a long way to go to try to restore the damage that's been caused over the last 50 or 60 years. But I think elevating climate vulnerability might be more translatable in other countries. And then, although Justice40 doesn't do this, I think focusing at the state or provincial level might also be something that could be expanded currently in Justice40. In the US, there are a couple of states, particularly California and Washington on the West Coast, and New York and Massachusetts on the East Coast, that have their own state legislation, not just an executive order related to environmental justice and climate equity. So there could be some important insights and lessons from those state level policies that are, enacted into law.
Those were all the questions that I wanted to ask, but I always like to ask if there's anything that you wish I'd asked or that you'd like to tell me, just in case I missed something really important.
The only thing I would add in thinking about environmental justice policy broadly, and also it's hinted at within Justice40, but in a very indirect way, is the disconnect between federal and state policies like Justice40 and local land use decisions, land use policies. Because if you go back to one of the major drivers for environmental justice, the classic environmental justice scenario was the location of industries, polluting industries in neighborhoods of color, or not even private investments, but also public sector investments, like using roads and highways to break up, again, communities of color. So those decisions, while they were resources that may have come from the state and federal government, ultimately the location of some of the environmental injustices was caused by local land use policies. And so being able to align those local land use policies, let's say, more consistently with the goals and objectives of Justice40 is, something that we need to pay much, much closer attention to.
I found this episode so interesting because it sounds so simple to describe it, but then when, as we heard, you start thinking about actually implementing it, there are so many questions that are raised that I hadn't even thought about.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept. And I know listeners at the top were probably thinking, why are we talking about this policy solution that doesn't exist anymore? But I do think Justice40 is one of those things that, as you said, it sounds so simple, but it actually did involve really radical changes in how we think about the funding that's going to stopping climate change and like how you think about who's benefiting from different communities. And they unfortunately didn't really have time to work out all the kinks, but it was still a really important initiative. And I think for governments around the world, as the inequities of climate change start to become more obvious, and governments start to put more attention to this, they're going to be looking at Justice40 as an example that they can learn from. So it's still a super important concept for anybody who's interested in climate justice to think about going forward.
I really liked it as a concept. I really liked that there were such smart people that were working on ironing out all of the wrinkles that come along with implementing something so large. The way that they were trying to figure out even how to track where to send the funding, how to spend it, what it gets used for. Because, we talk all the time about changing society, but you need these policies in order to do that. And policymaking is so interesting and it's really difficult to do. And I think it's the sort of thing that people don't they just kind of take for granted. And even though this is a policy that President Trump immediately rescinded, which we had a feeling was going to happen, the work that went into it, it's wild that it hadn't already been done. There's so much to learn from it, even just in the questions that were being asked. We just need stuff like this to stick. We can't do anything if every 4 years we're taking 3 steps backwards.
I think it goes to the shift recently in American politics to govern so much through executive orders because there's so much gridlock in Congress. Like, legislation really does have more staying power than an executive order that can quite easily be signed away. So that's maybe something to be said. If you're thinking about this from a jurisdiction that is not America, maybe a law is the way to go.
Yeah. I mean, it would be really nice if, the Canadian government would mobilize on something like this. I would love to see a transition plan at all. It doesn't need to be a 40%, although that would be great. I'd love to see a Justice40, where it's like spending should be thoughtfully done so that we're not leaving communities behind or making communities worse off with the changes that we're doing, We also need to be giving communities money so that they can actually do stuff.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that, we'll see whether these lessons from Justice40 are taken in the environmental justice and racism strategy that we're going to see from the Canadian government at some point in the future. So this is like an effort that certainly is underway here. It's an effort that's underway in European countries as well. Incorporating environmental justice into climate action is definitely on the policy radar. I think you're going to see initiatives, maybe not exactly like Justice40, but that start to incorporate that same kind of thinking in the future. And that's really exciting, I think.
I think so, too. I really liked where the mindset was. And a lot of the episode was just them being like, this is hard.
It is.
And it is. But I think, we need smart, cool people doing that work. Let's pay them for it.
Yeah, you're right. We absolutely should be paying folks to study this stuff. I bet there's some academics out there that would love to.
Even if we just decided to drill until all of the oil was gone, the oil is rapidly disappearing. Like, we are fracking more and more, which means that we are pumping fresh water into oily ground to get stuff that's poisoning us. It's disappearing. It's disappearing. And so, even if you don't care about climate change or think it's fake, we need to transition away because these jobs are not going to last forever.
Yeah, I have to imagine, though, there are no climate deniers that listen to this podcast.
Just rage listening.
If you're out there and you're like, you know what, I love this whole prison abolition thing, but I'm not so sure about climate change.
Yeah. For that listener, we got to think about a just transition away from fossil fuels anyways, regardless.
And I think another thing that we hopefully wanted to highlight with Justice40 as well is that there are benefits, right? There are co-benefits when we act on climate change. I know you and I both hated that book, How to Be a Climate Optimist. But it's true. There are lots of benefits to climate action. And the more that our discussions focus on that, and hopefully also, as in the focus of Justice40, on making sure that there's fair access to those benefits, I think the more people are going to be jazzed about climate action. And that's really where we want to be.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to end this episode. Kristen, thank you so much. Listeners, if you would like more progressive Canadian podcasts, then please visit the Harbinger Media Network at harbingermedianetwork.com, and we will catch you on the next episode. We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.